Hi, now it's time to think about moving on, but we still need to keep in mind all that stuff we studied about alienation and different forms of it, because we're going to ask a really big applied philosophical question here, which is how do we create a free society? How do we ensure that people have freedom? And I guess what that means is that we need to imply or we need to explore what is freedom. So our overall goal is we're going to start thinking about this question. What's the best way to create a free society? And the way we're going to explore that is we're going to read a bit of a bridging document. And this document here is a document written by Karl Marx, and the document is called On the Jewish Question. Now, we need to read this and we need to explore its criticism of bourgeois secular ideology and explain what that means as we go through this lesson, okay? And we need to consider the best way to ensure people's freedoms. We don't need a definite opinion about it so far. So what I'd like you to do for me as an APK is just to draw a picture of Uncle Carl. Just draw a picture of him so that way we can then think about the man who was putting forth these notions that may seem a bit strange to people who haven't actually studied Marx and Marx's historical context. Can you do that for me, please? Okay, where do we start? Well, remember the philosopher we talked about by the name of, well, there he is. It just comes up when you hover over him these days. How cool is that? Remember the philosopher we talked about by the name of Hegel, the father of a lot of young Hegelian philosophers, and I mean that in a metaphorical sense. And the young Hegelians that followed his study, and they really had something against religion. Well, when we think about that, when we think about Hegel and Hegel's legacy, and a lot of atheists adopted Hegel's points of view, we kind of understand a bit of the context of what this document's going to be about. See, there was this guy called Bruno Bohr, or a German philosopher, and a member of the rationalist philosophy, the rationalist school in philosophy. And he really thought that, like Feuerbach, the issue with society is that it kind of adopts and tries to control people through religious identities. Okay. And he was very sympathetic about the plight of the Jewish people. And he thought that the way to deal with persecution that happens against the Jews is to move towards creating a secular state. And a secular state is a state that has no official religion attached to it. It's where you have total separation between church and state. So the church is not allowed to influence or have any say in how government is run. But in turn, the government is not allowed to suppress any religion or favour any religion. And if you separate the two and you have a genuinely secular society, in theory, no one ideological or religious ideology will be able to take over and oppress other religions. And I think also, from his point of view, Bruno was kind of arguing for a secular state, but I think he was pretty much arguing for people to move away from like religious conceptions of themselves and religious identities. And he thought doing that would allow you to, or allow the Jews to move away from the persecution that they were experiencing as Jews. So take a note. So that helps us understand a bit of the context of this document here, which is a very famous document in philosophy. This document is called On the Jewish Question. And what I've done is, because I want to be able to use the textbook as an inroad, I've basically taken a photo of the excerpt they've taken. So you can always refer to your textbook if you need be. All right. So what a lot of people have accused Marx of is giving into racial stereotyping through this document, because as Marx discusses the Jewish question, which is really a kind of academic way of saying how do we liberate Jewish people, um, he makes a lot of assumptions that give into assuming that, like all Jews are like Shylock from The Merchant of Venice. They're primarily concerned with making money and using money to make a living. And if you cannot, obviously we've studied Marxism before, quite quickly the Jew gets associated with being the bourgeoisie, right? Now, the reason why we need to be really careful about this document is it's not anti-Semitic in the way that Nazis are anti-Semitic. If you actually read this document and you try and get an understanding for its context, what you find is that Marx doesn't believe that there's anything kind of innate in a Jewish person that makes them, uh, you know, that gives rise to the stereotype. There's nothing born within the Jew or within the Jew that makes them the money hungry um, capitalists that they've often been associated with. And I'm not saying that Jewish people are like that, but it's quite clear, though, that that's the association that existed around about Marx's time, right? Now, Marx is being, I think, a little bit anti-Semitic because the document does give off that stereotype. It does kind of convey the Jewish culture as a culture that is money hungry uh, and bourgeois and very, self-interested. And you can imagine that through this document, it's been appropriated by very extreme elements, both on the left and the right, to justify the persecution of the Jews. Because it's very easy to say that instead of an abstract class called the bourgeoisie or the capitalist, there's an actual race of people, and then you follow all the other stereotypes with hook noses and hunchbacks that are, stealing money and basically, ruining us all. And of course, that kind of logic leads to, a lot of the anti-Semitism of Nazism, which is really dangerous and vile. So, look, you can understand that it's anti-Semitic in the way that it doesn't try and challenge the stereotype, but it's not anti-Semitic in the assumption that there's something genetic or innate within the Jew that makes them like this. In fact, if you were to understand Marxism properly and you understood the argument about his role of history and social relations, what Marx is really trying to do is have a look at what he believes are the concrete historical circumstances that have placed a Jewish person in the role of what's typically associated as the capitalist. And he believes that the only way that you can emancipate Jewish people, which is what he wants to do, he doesn't want to lock them up and kill them, but he wants to actually free them. The only way to do that is the way that you would emancipate everyone else. Okay, so take some notes. All right, so you should have a fair idea about the context of this document because if you can't really understand what this is all about unless you've studied all that stuff about alienation, okay? You can't. So that's why we spent those 3 or 4 weeks looking at that theory. So when we read this document, we're going to have a fair understanding of what it is that Marx is actually trying to suggest we should do, okay? So let's start reading this and we'll stop at every point and we'll get you to take some notes about the things that he's really trying to say, all right? Now, first of all, when this was written, Marx was really looking over to the United States of America, yeah, a society that had thrown away the feudal state and had tried to create a kind of bourgeois, even though it was imagined as some kind of agrarian, but a capitalist bourgeois society, right? And that's what it was evolving into around about 1843 anyway. And he noticed that a lot of Jewish people were doing quite well there, and they were living the American dream, right? And that's really important to note. So in his mind, you can see that the Jew is being associated with the capitalists or the bourgeoisie. Now, let's also give you some other historical context. There are a lot of Jewish people that call themselves Marxist, and Marx was a Jew. In fact, Marx was a Jew who saw his dad convert to Lutheranism in order to maintain or keep his job, because the Prussian state wouldn't allow Jews to practice law at the time. So he actually had to change his religion in order to change his job. So he's part of the persecution as well. And maybe that might be part of the motivation of this document. All right. So take some notes. Okay. So first of all, he says, let us notice first of all that the so-called rights of man. Here I need to talk to you about another famous philosophical document. There was a document written by Thomas Paine called The Rights of Man, which tried to outline what we would call a bourgeois notion of civil rights and freedom, where the state or the government would exist to protect certain rights that allowed a human being to maintain itself as free. Okay. And that's a very strong theory and it still exists today. So if you're thinking about the US Bill of Rights, it's very much aligned with the philosophies of Thomas Paine and the philosophies that came about in the French Revolution, where people thought that you had certain rights that were protected by the state in order to ensure your freedom. And that's what Marx is really talking about here. The rights of man are these civil rights that allow you to maintain that freedom. So take some notes. So he says here, let us note first of all that the so-called rights of man are simply the rights of a member of civil society, so a society with civilized institutions such as courts of law, government, etc., right? The rights of the member of civilized society, that is of egoistic man. I'll get into that right now. When he says egoistic man, he is trying to get you to think about an individualistic man, an individualist. But remember, that would be a really bad term for Marx because he's not against the individual. But he believes that the individual is someone who realizes themselves through social interaction and becoming part of a society. And he really likes that idea. An egoist is a false individual, a person who believes in rugged individualism that's separate from others and achieves his freedom by being almost alone, isolated. Do you get what I mean? It's the person who believes that everything is a result of his own actions, his own contributions to what he does, and that he really has no social connection. So an egoist is someone who believes they are individual because they choose to be isolated from others. Take a note. So that is of egoistic man. So study are simply the rights of a member of civil society, that is of egoistic man, of man separated from other men and from the community. He says it right there. He defines what egoistic man is. The most radical constitution, that of the of 1793, right, says these rights, the natural and imprescriptible rights, are equality, liberty, security, and property. Now, I'm going to get you to look up and see what constitution was written in 1793. And then I'd like you to tell your next door neighbor. Go for it. Again, so you know a bit of your Marxism and you should have realized that this was a French constitution, which was looking at equality, liberty, security, and property. You probably would get rid of the equality part if you were looking at an American constitution, okay? So he's saying the most radical constitution of 1793 says that these rights are protected, all right? And then he goes to try and break down these rights, in particular this idea of liberty. Liberty meaning freedom. Now, liberty is the right to do everything which does not harm others. So he's basically saying this is what people have often associated freedom with. The limits within each individual can act without harming others is determined by law. So he's saying law tells us what we can do and how we can act without harming others. Just as a boundary between two fields is marked by a stake. In other words, when we think of defining this liberty, we think about this defining this liberty by separating our actions from other people. We think about how we do something which doesn't impact on or hurt other people. In fact, we don't think of liberty or freedom as acting with people. We think of it as acting separately from people. Take a note. Now, if man is a social animal, automatically we've got a recipe for some kind of alienation built into this conception of what is freedom. Liberty as a right of man is not founded upon the relations between man and man, but rather on the separation of man from man. He just says it there. Liberty as a right is formulated in some kind of alienating way. Take a note. It is the right of the circumscribed individual. So circumscribed means the individual as defined by law, withdrawn into himself. And that makes perfect sense here because what he's saying here is you act in a way which solely involves you and what's in your interest as long as it doesn't harm others. And that's how we define freedom. You withdraw completely into yourself. There's a bit of Christian connotations here because remember, even though Marx was an atheist, he would have seen himself as sharing a legacy of Western thought and Western enlightenment. So he would have said, withdrawing into yourself is some kind of evil. Notions of that would be reflected through literature in the past. The most notable one, I think, would be in Dante's Inferno, where you get to the center of hell and you find the most evil being that exists has complete love withdrawn in on himself, and that's why he's covered in a massive block of ice. That's just a literary quote to help you kind of further contextualize what he's saying by withdrawn into himself. Okay. The right of property is dot dot dot, which means a bit's been cut out. The right to enjoy one's fortune and dispose of it at one's will. So here he's saying here's another normal assumption about what it means to enjoy your property. And property is a right. See, right here. Without regard for other men and independently of society. So basically, when we think about this egoistic version of our right to private property, it's basically about enjoying what you own without any consideration for other people or enjoying it with other people. Take a note. It is the right of self-interest. In other words, basically owning property means just thinking about your own self-interest. And that leads every man to see in other men not the realization, but rather the limitations of his own liberty. So, okay, he's saying you've got this idea of liberty. It's conceived in a way that is basically separating you from someone else. You do your own internal actions without even thinking about finding freedom with other people. But then also you think about the right of private property, and what it really is this idea of being able to do whatever you like without even caring about other people. So you just do what you like for your own self-interest. And then if other people get in the way of that, then they're a pain in the bum. So your limitations on your liberty are other people because they get in the way of you doing what you want to do without any regard to anybody else. Take a note. All right. So then he goes on to criticize security. Security is the supreme social concept of any civil society. Of course, we all want security. The whole society exists only in order to guarantee for each of its members the preservation of his person, his rights, and his property. Security is the assurance of his egoism or its egoism. Now, what it basically means is that if you think that the right of private property is essential and you think the right of liberty is essential, and you've conceived of private property as the right to dispose of and do anything with your private property as you wish because you own it, and you've conceived of liberty as being able to do whatever you want as long as it doesn't harm others, and you're not thinking about how to use your property and wealth to enhance the life of others, and you're not thinking about using your liberty or finding freedom and liberty in relationships with other people and growing through other people, then you are going to create a society that tries to make sure that these two rights are protected and that everyone's secure in doing so, but that will then encourage their psychology to evolve in a very egotistical way. Take a note. So what's happening so far is that we're seeing that relationship between the economic and technological base of a bourgeois society and its superstructure. Here's a legal document which is basically affected by the way that it views property and social relations. So the way that liberty and private property are assumed to exist and assumed to be is heavily determined on the relationships that produce them and the relationships that allow people to own them and have these rights. So you can see the relationship between both the superstructure and the base structure is right here in Marx's criticism, okay? And let's go on to see if this is the case again. None of the supposed rights of man go beyond egotistic man. So this kind of means the limited individual, the false individual. That is, an individual separated from the community, withdrawn into himself, wholly preoccupied with his private interest and acting in accordance with his own private caprice. Caprice means I can do whatever I want at a whim. I don't have to think about it too much, just whenever I want. The only bond between men is natural necessity. In other words, it's what I need to do. Need and private interests, the preservation of their property and their egotistic interests. So, at the end of this document, what Marx is saying is that when you build a society based on these notions of bourgeois rights, you tend to create a bunch of egotistical, self-interested people who don't realize that they could be free or enhance their lives through the relationships they have with other people, and don't realize that other people are a source of emancipation and wealth, right? And the document really is calling on Jewish people to reject that kind of bourgeois notion of these freedoms and try and seek a more authentic existence where society is structured in a way to allow you to achieve fulfillment through connection with other people, through community, not necessarily through these rights that create egotistical, self-interested men. All right. So in a sense, it's not anti-Semitic because what it's trying to do is it's trying to liberate Jewish people. It is anti-Semitic because it makes an assumption that the bourgeoisie is the capitalist. Okay. So, sorry, the bourgeoisie is the Jew. All right. So let's go back to here. We did explore the historical context of what this document called on the Jewish question. We did read this text to explore its criticism on bourgeois secular ideology. It's basically saying in this document, it's saying you come up with this idea of the rights of man, but in turn, when you do that, you're kind of conceiving of freedom and a better society as one that's secular without, the need for God to run it. However, you still are trapped by the way capitalism makes you think about freedom and happiness and etc. There are, even, capitalism does do things to you that are a little, well, capitalism psychologically conditions you, is basically what the document's saying. So transcend that psychological conditioning and seek a more authentic existence, which escapes the contradictory assumptions made here that I've just exposed. Now, what we haven't done is we haven't really thought about whether rights and freedoms, whether the rights produce more freedom or whether or not making a society that doesn't alienate produces more freedom. And I guess we need to do that. Now let's just I'll just pause here and I'll just put one more face up. Do you remember this man? This is Pol Pot. Now he took this whole idea of creating the community and subordinating everyone to the community to the nth degree. People were murdered and massacred as a result of it, and it was brutal. And you know what? Most people would say that if rights, not necessarily property rights, but if human rights were kind of respected here, and if human rights were actually protected, you wouldn't have had the mass injustices that occurred under Pol Pot's regime. And, a lot of people say that he's quite intellectually banal. I mean, who wants to create an agrarian socialist utopia anyway? And why would you create a revolution if it requires so much violence? Clearly, society's not ready for it. But there are other things that he just didn't get. But basically, if society respected human rights, then you wouldn't have seen the atrocities that happened under his name. And so maybe it was a bit naive of Marx to assume that you should be pursuing a highly authentic existence. But I have one other thing to show you. One other thing. Often we're pretty good at showing criticisms of dictators that have followed under Marx's names. But, if I go look up sweatshops in Indonesia, if I look at factories in China, if I look at things that happened under Pinochet, Guatemala, lots and lots of countries that are not Marxist, but have put in really big tax-free havens. You've created basically a society that's supposedly based on, you know, civil rights or the rights outlined, but obviously it's completely alienating. I mean, where's the freedom here, you know, in this factory where you're working extremely long hours and you don't fulfill yourself through your labor, and you're certainly not enjoying a kind of connection you receive with others. Plus, I am going to say this quite clearly as well. You know, Pol Pot massacred many, many people, but also how many people have been massacred in order to keep these factories going in dictatorships that don't really respect labor laws or human rights in terms of labor rights, etc. So, you know, it's a double-edged sword. We just need to be really, really objective here, and we can understand that the document that Marx was putting forward still has some relevance because it talks about the importance of dealing with alienation. But in so many societies that have claimed to have done something under Marx's name, you can't help but think if human rights were protected, then the atrocities that happened under Marx's name, which he certainly would have disagreed with, in fact, he would have despised, would have would never have happened. And let's not forget too, many historians have said that Marx would have been persecuted by these regimes because they wouldn't have agreed with that libertarian aspect of his writing. And consequently, he would have benefited from human rights as well, or rights as a theory. Okay? That's it. Cheers.